All right, state who's going to be your first witness.
Your Honor, the state intends to present victim impact through Felicia Demerson and through photographic evidence.
Okay, very good. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give in this class is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so that's God? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I support counsel. Ms. Demerson, good morning.
Morning.
Ms. Demerson, I want to show you a couple of photographs. I'm showing you state's penalty number 2. That's a photograph you provided to our office.
Yes.
Does the photograph show you and Felicia?
Yes.
Okay. And where was that photograph taken?
At my nephew's reception after his graduation.
Okay. And I'm going to show you state's penalty number 3. Is that potentially a selfie taken by Felicia?
Yes.
Okay, so a photograph taken of her with a cell phone?
Yes.
Okay. And then state's penalty 1. Can you tell us where that photograph was taken?
That was taken at a wedding that I coordinated, and she was the flower girl.
Okay. All right. Your Honor, I would tender state's penalty 1, 2, and 3.
Any objection?
Objection.
Admitted.
Publishing state's penalty 1. Ms. Demerson, you can look up over your right shoulder of that screen. So that's a picture of Felicia at that wedding?
Yes.
Okay. State's penalty 2. And this is the picture of you and your daughter?
Yes.
And state's penalty 3, this is a photograph that Felicia took of herself.
Yes.
Looks like she's laying on a mattress, maybe?
That's Ebony's mattress.
Okay. Ms. Demerson, have you prepared a statement that speaks to your daughter's uniqueness as a person?
Yes.
And does it also express the loss that you and your family have felt
Yes.
from her death?
Yes.
Can you please read that, if you could, to the jurors?
On December 9th, 2004, at 1:56 p.m., God blessed me with an 8-pound, 1-ounce healthy baby girl who I had the honor of naming Felicia Nicole Williams. But to others, she was known as Sugar Plum. I knew when she was first born that she would be my special child. And that's because she had that drive and will and was always determined to make things happen. I can remember back in June of 2013 when I had my foot surgery. She stayed in the house the whole entire summer, nursing me back to health. And not only did she do that, she also cooked for me, bathed me, and Sugar Plum also at the time of my surgery made sure my baby, who was 2 years old at the time, was well cared for. Even though Felicia was 9 years old, she was very smart, advanced, and very wise beyond her years. Like an elderly person would say, she was an old soul. Felicia loved riding her 3 bikes that she got for Christmas that following year. She liked going to the park and enjoying going to the pond and feeding the ducks. She was a cheerleader. She sang faithfully in the youth choir at the New Zion Holiness Church, where I am a faithful member. She was active with the International Free and Accepted Martyr Masons and Order of the Eastern Stars Blue Valley Youth Court, number 203, which has now been renamed in her honor as Blue Valley Felicia Williams Youth Court, number 203. In our church, they honor her by setting a seat aside with a black bow in remembrance of her for 30 days. I could remember the last conversation I had with Sugar Plum on May 16, 2014 at 4 p.m., and she never departed from her mommy without telling me that she loved me. Sugar Plum didn't only touch lives through death, she also touched lives through living. Sugar Plum had her first job at a local barbershop, sweeping the floor and taking the trash out. She never met a stranger. She came home at times after riding her bicycle bearing gifts from where she helped a neighbor or elderly person take out their trash, feeding their dogs, or just sitting on their porch and keeping them company. But you truly will never understand what a unique individual you took from us. Not only was she a daughter, she was a granddaughter to 4 sets of grandparents, a goddaughter, a niece, whom one of her aunts gave the honor of being nicknamed Sugar Plum. And she was an awesome aunt herself to her 2 nieces at the time of her demise. She was a sister to her 6 siblings who miss her tremendously and hurt every day. Felicia's death has affected my life and took its toll on my entire family. Even though it's been 5 years, it feels like 5 days ago. I have not yet returned to work. I've been diagnosed with chronic depression. I'm on 7 different types of medication trying to cope with this new normal called life. Some days I don't know whether I'm coming or going. Matthew 18:16. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large milestone hung around their neck and to be thrown in the depths of the sea. That scripture is talking to someone that knows better. And Granville Ritchie knew better.
Thank you, Ms. Demerson. I have no other questions.
Okay, any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am.
The state of Florida to recall Dr. Downs.
Okay.
What do you need?
Tissues.
No. She needs to just leave for a few moments.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Let's take a break, okay?
All rise, jury exiting.
It's okay. Okay, let's just take a 10-minute breather. Okay, I'm sorry, doctor. We're getting ready to put you back on the stand, but we're going to take just a breather, give everyone a chance to gain control of their emotions, okay? All right.
But I did not see what happened. It appeared that one of the jurors
Juror,
emotional.
yes, juror, I think it's, hold on one second. I'm going to use the initials. Let me find my list here. Initials VA, and it would be juror number 23. It appears that she became very emotional and got very upset, and she started crying. And so juror CB next to her said, we need to take a break. Who was our foreperson? She said, we need to take a break. She's upset. We need to take a break. So that's what we're doing, is taking a break.
Very good.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. right, I'll be back in a few, okay?
Judge, and frankly, I was not looking in that direction.
Quiet, please, on the record.
Go ahead.
I personally was not looking in that direction, but in addition to what's been described already, that this witness or this juror basically got very emotional on the victim impact statement, I would not only, but I've also been informed that several other jurors, including the foreperson, was very sensitive to her feelings and showing that response. I would move to strike the entire panel at this time. I think that juror should be struck, but I think in light of the fact that there was a reaction by the entire panel, merits striking the entire jury panel.
State what your response.
Judge, my response is the juror acted as responsibly as she possibly could as a juror. She was becoming emotional. They're human beings, they're not machines. That was emotional victim impact. It's meant to be emotional to demonstrate the uniqueness and the loss to the community of a little 9-year-old girl. And she, in a very mature and responsible fashion, the juror asked to be excused before she became more emotional. But as far as the emotion she showed, she took efforts to turn her head away, duck down towards her belly, and to somewhat disguise her emotion so she could get out of the courtroom and not influence the other jurors. At least that's what I saw.
That is basically what I saw as well. So I do think that it is unreasonable to think that, in light of the facts of this case, that any juror would be able to avoid all signs of emotion or exhibit, not be able to kind of contain their emotions. So I can see how that can happen. This juror did do the correct thing. She asked immediately that we take a break. So I'm not going to strike the panel, and at this point in time, I'm not going to strike this juror. When they come back in, I am just going to remind them that at this phase, there will be decisions they have to make as a group, and then ultimately there will be decisions that they will have to make as individuals, and not to be impacted by any other juror's response to the evidence as it comes in. Okay?
Judge, with the court, we would ask that there be an individual inquiry of that particular jury that was.
That's fine. I'll bring her in. Okay, so let's bring in juror number 23, initials VA.
All rise, juror entering.
Hello. Just have a seat real quick. You can, wanna
Oh,
come up
so
here?
have a seat?
You're fine, well, you're good, just stay right there.
Okay.
You're perfectly fine, everyone else have a seat.
Okay.
So I know that you got very upset, which, listen, I understand, okay? I just wanna make sure that you feel that you'll be able to continue on and listen to all of the evidence, and, you just wanna make sure that you're not gonna be so overwhelmed with emotion.
This was just the very personal part, and I recently had a loss, and it just brought that feeling
Okay.
back.
Okay.
But the rest is probably going to be okay. I
Okay.
feel confident that it will.
Okay, and so listen, and we're just gonna rely upon you. If you get to a point where you feel like, you know what, this is getting overwhelming, and maybe I need to tap out
Correct.
because I don't know that I can really go the distance, you just need to let us know.
Right.
Okay.
We were talking about that in there, and I told him that I would absolutely let them know
Yeah.
if I couldn't anymore.
Yeah, which is exactly
Yeah.
what you should do.
Okay.
And so we're gonna just rely upon you to let us know,
Okay.
okay?
All right.
All right, any questions?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, any questions? Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Do you want me to just bring the rest of the jury out?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and have a seat,
Okay.
and then we'll bring out everybody else. Okay, very good, everyone have a seat. Okay, so, let me just speak with you all a little bit. So, I've been a judge for 17 years, I've seen a lot. This is as tough as it gets, okay? So, none of you should feel bad or that you're letting anyone down if you feel yourself getting upset. It is human, it is normal. But all that we ask is that if you feel that way, if you feel it coming on, say, Judge, I gotta take a break. Raise your hand and let us know. And if it gets to the point where you feel like, you know what, I am so overwhelmed with emotion that I don't know if I can go the distance on this, you just gotta let us know, okay? But I don't want anyone to feel that you're letting anybody down or you're not doing your job if you start to get upset or get overwhelmed. As I told you, this is as tough as it gets, all right? Okay, so you just let me know. All right, with that, we're ready to proceed,
Yes, Your Honor.
okay?
The state will call Dr. Downs to recall.
Does he need to be sworn in again, Judge?
Yeah, he'll be sworn in again for the penalty phase.
Sir, if you stop there before.
Do you solemnly swear from the testimony you're about to give in this cause the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Go ahead and step up here,
Yes, sir. Have a seat in the witness stand.
All right, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for
All the
having
way
me.
down from Georgia. Appreciate it. I want to talk to you this morning, Doctor. You have gone through in your testimony in a very thorough fashion last week and told us about the different injuries that Felicia suffered during the attack on her. What I want to talk to you about now, we'll kind of work our way through the different injuries, is both the physical pain and suffering that Felicia felt during the infliction of those injuries and sustaining the injuries, and then also her associated ability to fear several different types of emotions during that time, and what types of emotions those types of injuries would evoke based on your medical experience.
Yes.
Okay, fair enough?
Yes, sir.
All right, so we'll start with some of the outlying injuries. You had told us earlier last week, and in fact you gave me a pretty good shaking showing us the shoulder injuries. You had told us that those could have been caused by someone grabbing her shoulder, shaking her, or holding her down on the ground, pushing down on her. Is that an accurate statement?
Yes, sir, it is.
Are those portions of the body, both the skin and the underlying structures that were injured, do they have nerves in them? Are they innervated?
Yes, sir.
And would she have experienced pain in those areas during those infliction of those injuries?
Yes, sir.
Can you tell us what type of pain she would have suffered?
They're pretty extensive, deep bruises. I can't tell you a specific quantifiable amount, but if you consider that you've got bleeding into the muscle tissue of the shoulders, it's going to be significantly painful.
All right. Now, you also told us about injuries to Felicia's, I think it was the front of her head. Some type of blunt force injury there?
Yes, sir, the right forehead.
Okay. And we didn't really see, because of probably the post-mortem artifact on her body, but we saw revealed skin with revealed internal hemorrhaging and bruising to that area. Was that an accurate statement?
It is.
And you told us that could have been caused by someone boxing or striking her there?
Either someone hitting her a fist, it could be a weapon like a board. There's nothing specific, but it was a significant impact with some type of blunt object.
And is that type, or is that section of the anatomy, does it also have nerves and other internal structures where pain is sensed?
Yes, sir. The face is actually highly innervated. It's very sensitive.
So that would have been in a sensitive area.
Yes, sir.
What type of quantitative or level of pain would she have suffered from that?
Given the large size of that bruise to an area that's got a lot of nerves in it, I would expect that injury to be very significantly painful.
Now, in quantitating that, we think commonly of, and I think everyone has probably had this experience, standing up underneath an open cabinet door and hitting your head, or hitting your head on something. And that would be a much smaller area that's affecting the head, would it not, a situation like that?
Yes, sir. And a situation you describe, you're talking, maybe a centimeter or something like that. This was a significantly larger injury.
Being larger and over a greater surface area, would there be a greater amount of pain sensed by the person suffering that?
I think initially you're going to have the same pain sensation regardless. Given the size of this, I would expect this area to continue to be painful because it is such a large area of bleeding, and basically that bleeding is going to cause swelling of the tissues, so it's going to continue to be painful.
Would that also be true of the injuries to the shoulder?
Yes.
So it's not as if you're going to get an infliction, you're going to feel pain, and it goes away. This is going to continue to ache, and she would have continued to feel pain as long as she was conscious?
Yes, sir. If you think about getting hit by an object, for example, if you're hit by a baseball, there's a certain level of pain, but that pain doesn't go away. It actually increases as the tissues start to swell. And given the volume of blood in both shoulders as well as the forehead, I would expect that pain to intensify if you're just talking about the specific pain from the injury. Now, obviously, the head injury is going to be more painful. There's more nerves there. That's going to be more painful from the shoulders, but both are going to be painful.
Okay. There were injuries to Felicia's tongue, and you indicated those could have been caused during her struggling or by processes related to strangulation. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. I believe that's what happened to her.
All right. And relating this to maybe some type of common situation that we could all understand. You bite your tongue maybe when you're chewing on food, or something hits you on the bottom of the mouth at some point when you're unexpecting it or don't expect it, and you bite the tip of your tongue or a portion of your tongue. Would that be a similar type of injury, first of all?
It's a similar type of mechanism. The injuries here are larger than what I would expect from a simple bite when you mischew your food and you catch your tongue. These are deep in the body of the tongue tissue, on the side as well as in the tip.
Is the tongue an innervated section or anatomy?
It is.
Is it highly innervated?
Yes, sir. Similar to the face. There's a lot of nerves there. The tongue, if you think about all the nerves to allow us to taste food, there's a lot of nerves specifically to the tongue.
And is it an especially sensitive area?
Yes, sir.
Do injuries to the tongue, are they associated with fairly high levels of pain because of that more sensitivity and the higher level of innervation?
Yes, sir. In addition, it's another confined space. In this case, the tongue is kind of limited. It goes from one side of your mouth inside your teeth to the other. So any bleeding in that area is going to swell, and likewise stimulate the pain receptor nerves in that confined space.
Associated to the injuries on the shoulder and the injury to the head, you had testified earlier there was an injury in the middle of Felicia's back.
Yes, sir.
Do you believe that was associated in some form or fashion during this attack to the injuries to her shoulder or possibly the injury to her head?
Yes, sir. I believe the mechanism, and I spoke a little bit about this earlier, I think that there was one event overall, and then an episode within that event is she's forcibly pushed against something, either a wall, the floor, but her shoulders are grabbed and she is forced into that position. At some point in time, her head is struck. That may have been part of that process. It may have happened before, it may have happened after. But I incorporate all of those as one episode within the overall event.
You don't believe these were individually inflicted separately in time and space. You believe this is all occurring at one time during a single attack.
I do. It certainly could have been separate events which would have prolonged the overall episode. For instance, someone could have grabbed her, held her, shaken her, then pushed her, bruising her back, and then hit her in the head. That would merely prolong the trauma of all of those separate episodes within the overall event. Reasonably, I think that they all kind of happened around the same time as part of the process I described. Grabbing, pushing her down on the floor, holding her down on the floor, popping her in the head. That makes sense, as that could have been one overall episode.
In a struggle such as what we're contemplating happened to Felicia in this case, where she's going to end up being strangled or is being attacked, do individuals in that situation commonly move their head about?
Yes, sir. They're struggling to escape whatever hold they're in. It's a natural response that human beings have called fight or flight. The adrenaline kicks in, your secretions start drying up, your heart rate goes up, you start breathing more, and you're in fear of that process, and part of that is trying to escape whatever hold you're in, whatever's preventing you from fleeing.
I'm going to go into some more detail about some of the individual injuries, but you kind of mentioned something that you believe this was an overall, these injuries were all inflicted in a single attack or a single episodic attack. Taking into account all of the injuries to her body, from her groin all the way up to her head, do you have any idea forensically or through your expertise in forensic pathology as to how long, just a minimum time it would have taken to inflict these injuries?
As I mentioned earlier, the strangulation process is going to take a couple of minutes. If you put the other injuries on top of that, just purely the mechanics of it, I'd say that would add at least another minute, and that's with basically one thrust causing the genital injuries, one thrust to the shoulders down that also incorporates the back. It could have been longer than that. I'm trying to give you the conservative, the minimum estimate.
Would it be fair to say at least minutes?
Yes, sir.
I want to just ask, would it assist you as we get into further detail now concerning the genitalia and the neck and the strangulation scenario to go back to your PowerPoint that you used earlier?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to just go through this until we get to an area of your PowerPoint dealing with the, is it back towards the end of your PowerPoint dealing with the genitalia?
Yes, sir. I think it's 3 from the end, I believe.
Okay, let's see if I can get through it. And we'll come back to the neck. Oh, before we move on to that, I did want to talk to you about this. You testified last week that there were areas underneath the insides of Felicia's lips where there appear to be some evidence that possibly there was some type of trauma there, but because of the circumstances that she was found in and the other injuries to her body that were post-mortem, you did not want to give a definitive opinion about those. Do you suspect, do you have a suspicion about these injuries to her lips?
Yes, sir.
The insides of her lips. And what is your suspicion about that?
The injuries that we see in picture 024, upper right, there are broad areas inside the lip. That's a protected area inside. And it's very common in suffocation cases where a hand is placed over the mouth to have injuries that appear similar to these. There are some other injuries that are more linear that look similar to, in picture 004, the rock, barnacle, oyster type injuries. So I'm not looking at, in 24, I'm not looking at those on her right. I'm looking at the broad, more irregular injuries. Those are the type of injuries, again, that I see in people that are suffocated or they have a hand placed over their mouth in order to keep them from crying out.
Okay. If that's what occurred to Felicia, would that have caused pain?
Yes, sir.
And is that also a very highly innervated area of the body?
Yes, sir.
And is it a sensitive area of the body?
Very.
And that's contained inside of the mouth where most of the surface area is maintained in a wet or fluid situation, correct?
That's correct.
Does that lend itself to more sensitivity? The inside of the mouth, the tongue?
The fact that it's wet?
Well, the fact that it's in a moist environment like that?
Well, there's a lot going on with her physiologically. Again, that fight or flight response, the secretions are drying up in her mouth. So just right off the bat, she would be, if anything, more inclined to feel pain simply because that process is going on. In addition, she's conscious, she's feeling an occlusion of her airway there, pressure. That is triggering and compounding the fight or flight response.
All right, I may revisit those injuries in a few minutes as we move on. So I'm going to take you to the injuries to Felicia's genitalia. Okay. You've testified these injuries are consistent with sexual assault, sexual battery, is that right?
Yes, sir.
And consistent with being caused during penetration by either the use of a penis or some other object?
Some object, that object could be a penis.
Okay. Is this area of the human body, of Felicia's body, a highly innervated area?
Yes, sir.
And is it sensitive, that area of the body?
Yes, sir.
And does it have a higher level of sensitivity than other portions of the body because of its purpose, I guess, as far as reproduction?
Yes, sir.
Does that contribute to that?
Yes, sir.
These are sexual organs, correct?
It's the entrance to the vagina, so while the perineum or that area immediately adjacent isn't, I guess, technically a sexual organ, it's right there. So
Right. And the
with
injury,
that
okay.
caveat, yes.
All right. So this area is going to provide more sensitivity to provide sexual, when a person's an adult, sexual pleasure, things like that.
Yes, sir.
All right. And does it have to be sensitive basically to provide that? I can rephrase that.
Well, there's multiple areas there. There's the clitoris, which it would be pretty important in that process of sexual pleasure. I would say the innervation exactly where we're looking at that entrance to the vagina would assist in that process, but it wouldn't be essential in that process.
All right. All right. But it would be a sensitive area with sensitive tissue.
Oh, yes, sir. It would
Okay.
definitely, if used as designed, as for sexual gratification, I would expect that to add to the pleasure of that process, again, if it were used for that purpose.
So it would have more sensitivity, that area, due to the nature of the area that it's in, I guess.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, would these injuries to that section of her body, would they have caused pain?
Yes, sir.
Would the hypersensitivity of that area or the greater sensitivity of that area have contributed to the pain
Yes, sir.
and the presence of all the nerve endings and the innervation of that area?
Yes, sir. And it's not just the area that we see where the tearing is, but also the area within the body behind that. Because if she's penetrated, something is penetrating what in a novice would be a small area in a young child. So it's not just the tearing of the flesh that you see here, but it's the overstretching inside her vagina that's associated with that.
Even without notable or apparent injury?
That's correct.
Now, is it possible that these injuries, including the two external injuries we see, plus the injury to her hymen and the injury extending into the beginning of her vagina, is it possible that this occurred during one thrust, as you mentioned earlier, with a penis or something like a penis?
Yes, sir.
Is it also possible that these injuries occurred over the course of multiple thrusts from a penis into her vagina?
Yes, sir.
And if these were inflicted either by one penetration by the penis or by multiple penetrations by the penis, if this attack continued with her attacker, with this defendant continuing to penetrate her vagina over and over and over, would she continue to feel pain where these injuries are?
Yes, sir. You've got the baseline injury that's going to be painful. That is what we're seeing here. And every single thrust into that injured area with open skin is going to further be painful. It's going to make a bad situation worse because you're continuing the insult repeatedly over and over and over again. If you've got an assailant who is sweating, you've got an open wound, sweat gets into that area, that's going to be painful.
And you've indicated that in addition to these open injuries, these wounds to her vagina and to the fourchette area in front of her vagina, that if a penis, a grown man's penis was being inserted over and over into this 9-year-old's genitals, that just the penetration and the expansion of the internal vaginal canal would have been causing pain every time he penetrated her?
Yes, sir. This is a footprint, if you will, of the stretching inside. What happens is the vagina gets filled to the point where it can't take whatever object is being put in there. And the tissue is going to tear at the weak point. And this is the weak point. So whatever went in to the vagina is pushing against all the walls enough that we see the visible external footprint of that.
You mentioned earlier the fight or flight phenomena, and you indicated with her mouth would have been drying, possibly. That causes kind of dry mouth?
Yes, sir. Cotton mouth, I guess, would be the late
What
term
effect would that have on her genitals?
Same sort of thing. Your secretions are going to dry up because your body physiologically is in a different place. It's trying to either get out of a bad situation or to fight for your life.
How would that affect the level of pain that she was feeling?
I think it would be compounded by the pain in terms of her feeling more pain. I don't know that I can tell you that with any degree of certainty, but it clearly the pain would aggravate the fight or flight. The reverse may also be true. I just can't tell you with certainty that.
The internal structures of the vagina are basically made to be self-cleaning, and there is, just like in the mouth of human beings, there is the presence of liquid or moisture that's moving things out of the vaginal canal. Is that right?
That's correct.
Normally.
Yes, sir.
And is it those things that would begin to dry up in a fight or flight scenario?
Yes, sir. All the various secretions would dry up.
So any kind of natural lubrication that would be there, and I'm not talking about lubrication, extra lubrication that occurs when a woman becomes sexually excited, an adult woman, but I'm talking about just the natural moisture inside the vagina, that would begin to dry up.
Yes, sir.
And would that, as far as being penetrated by a penis, would that cause more friction between the surface of the penis and the surface of the interior of Felicia's vagina?
Yes, sir. There is less lubrication, so there is going to be more friction because things are rubbing together.
How about the phenomena, and we recall back to Dr. Alexander's testimony concerning the absence of Felicia's hymen. The fact that Felicia was being penetrated for the first time. What effect would that have? Is that something that would add to her, number one, physically, to her physical pain?
Yes, sir. Sex with a virgin and rupture of the hymen is a physically painful process, particularly in someone with a 9-year-old, a child who's not at an age where that sort of process is something we think should be happening.
And that can be a painful process even in an adult woman who is having sex for the first time and is sexually excited. Is that accurate?
Yes, sir. If a female that is excited, lubricated, and wants to have sex, it can still be, and oftentimes is, painful.
Now, we've talked about several injuries, the shoulder, the head, the tongue, the back, now the genitalia. But we have not talked about much about the emotional effect on Felicia. If assuming she was conscious during the infliction of these injuries up to this point, what we've talked about, not even talking about the structures of the neck, would this have had an effect on her emotionally?
Yes, sir.
And would fear become one of those emotional effects or experiences that she would have had?
Yes, sir.
Would she, if she was conscious when she was being raped and these injuries were being caused, would she have had the ability to express her fear and her anguish?
Unless there were something keeping her from doing that. For instance, we talked earlier about the hand over the mouth. That might be one way, but there's no reason why she wouldn't be trying to cry out or crying out and conscious until she's choked out.
All right. So even if the defendant had placed his hand over her mouth, and that would commonly be associated with muffling of something, isn't it? Muffling of crying out or screaming.
Yes, sir.
She would still have the ability to cry, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And to try to scream out or cry out.
Yes, sir. And one of the injuries that she has would tend to support that in the neck. If you remember the deep longus coli bleeding, that's not from a direct blow. I see that as more consistent with her thrashing about violently, as in trying to cry out.
This type of pain and the injuries we've talked about so far, would that cause someone to thrash about in pain? Would the pain itself cause them to move and react to it?
I have seen patients do that just from pain, trying to find some level of relief. There's got to be some position that's better than the one I'm in now.
How about the emotion of terror, of being terrified? Would she have been able to experience that during this time period before getting choked to the point of unconsciousness?
Yes, sir.
How about, and we're talking about a 9-year-old who's having a penis rammed into her body for the first time, how about the emotion of confusion, the confusion of a child over what is happening, why is he doing this? Would she be able to experience that?
Yes, sir.
Is that something you would associate to this type of injury?
Yes, sir.
And when you were talking about trying to muffle crying or yelling or screaming, could that, just putting your hand over someone's mouth, having inflicted the injuries we've already discussed, could that cause the emotion or the sensation of panic?
Clearly, yes, sir. If you think about the injuries that we looked at inside the lips, that's enough to rip through the mucous membrane of the lip down to expose the tissues there. Very painful, and I would expect that reaction of I'm bleeding into my mouth, I'm tasting my own blood, this is not letting up. What's going on? And if you know the assailant, that just adds a whole nother level.
And the panic that we're talking about, if she's experiencing panic, could that also be associated with her moving about, thrashing about, trying to get away?
Yes, sir.
Especially if his hand is over her mouth.
Yes, sir.
Occluding her air, her ability to get air.
The covering of the mouth, just the mouth, she would still be able to breathe through her nose,
Right.
but the process would be there of, I need to get this. The body has a physiological thing called air hunger, where you want air, you need air, you know that, your body knows that. It's a chemical reaction, primitive reflex. So anything that's going to tend to occlude your airway is going to enhance that process. Think about if you're underwater and you can't get up and you know you have to breathe and you can't get up. That's a position I personally have been in, and it's terrifying. And it's something that you don't have any control over until you get out of the environment.
And even partial occlusion of her airway, just her mouth being covered, associated with all the other injuries and with her trying to move, creating a greater demand, I would assume, for air.
Yes, sir.
Because she's struggling in her body, her heart rate's accelerated well, let's talk about that. Her heart would be accelerated, I would assume, based not only on the injuries and the response to that, but based on her fear and anxiety.
Again, the fight or flight response, the heart rate's going to go up, secretions are going to dry up, your heart's going to be pounding in your chest. You've got the terror that's going to add to the fight or flight, the pain that's going to add to the fight or flight. So all of these processes are happening on the body simultaneously.
I'm going to take your attention. Let's see if I can go the other direction. I guess I'll have to go back. Yeah. All right. Now, this slide we were just on, is this a slide if we talk about the internal injuries to the neck, or do you want me to move to a different slide?
Well, that, again, is a reminder of where the compression is. The blood vessels, the jugular vein is closer to the surface. The carotid artery is fairly deep. As you can see in the illustration there, it's very close to the spine. It's deep down inside the body. In this case, the jugular veins are compressed. We talked about the amount of force required to do that. And that's a continued force to occlude those to the point of unconsciousness. That force then has to stay there. Continue that occlusion for at least a minute, a couple of minutes, out to 5 minutes. That's if it's one application of the force and it's held there, and it's basically that single death grip. Anytime you release that grip, the clock resets to 0, and the victim can walk away. But if that grip is applied again, 10, 15 seconds to unconsciousness, a couple of minutes to death. But if you get to a minute and a half, release the grip, clock resets. 10 seconds, 15 seconds to unconsciousness, a couple of minutes to death. And it's a cycle. It really is when the assailant lets go, they control every second of that time. So it's a purposeful, up close and personal act where you have to touch the victim.
There was a slide in your PowerPoint that shows the internal musculature of the neck.
Yes, sir. I think it's about 6 or 7 slides beyond this one. There we go.
Okay. So I want to talk to you about before we get into the mechanism of strangulation and the effect on Felicia, I want to talk about the structures of the neck that were affected. You went through with Ms. Johnson the reflection of the neck muscles in the photographs showing the different layers of the neck or the internal muscles that had been damaged and had injuries. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. So there's injuries to the sternocleidomastoid muscles.
Yes, sir.
And there were injuries to, I believe, these muscles. I don't remember the name of the muscles.
Sternohyoid.
Sternohyoid. And I don't remember if these were the longest muscles, but...
Yes, sir.
Okay. So all of those different layers, there were hemorrhages and bruising, correct?
Yes, sir.
Are
In addition
those-
to several others.
In addition to several others. And I believe you said this was one of the strangulation cases where you had seen the greatest number of injuries or possibly one of the highest number of injuries to a strangulation case.
I believe the way I phrased it was I saw a lot more hemorrhages into neck musculature here than I usually see in strangulation cases. Usually I'll see 3, 4, 5 hemorrhages. Here I believe there were a total of 10.
Now, the areas that were affected that had hemorrhages, that were bruised, were those areas that have innervation?
Yes, sir.
And would Felicia have felt those bruises and those injuries? I'm talking about outside of just the process of strangulation. When those injuries are being inflicted on those muscles of the neck, would she have felt those?
Yes, sir.
If she was conscious?
She's conscious, she's going to feel not only the compression that causes that, but also just like in the shoulders, the bleeding is going to cause swelling of the tissue, and the muscles have a sheath around them. Again, it's a confined space. So bleeding into that confined space of each muscle pushes the boundaries and causes swelling, which causes pain. So each of those individual injuries, independent of any other injury, is going to be painful.
And talking about consciousness and the infliction of these injuries, the force that was required to cause these injuries, these internal injuries, you had a slide where you talked about foot-pounds of pressure and whatnot, and you described, I believe, that there was a significant amount of force being applied to her neck to cause not only the number of injuries, but how deep down into the structures those injuries were. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. So the process of inflicting these injuries, she would have necessarily have been conscious for at least a portion of those, if not a lot of them.
Unless she had been rendered unconscious by the blow to the head.
And you believe that was sufficient to render unconsciousness?
I can't eliminate that possibility. There was no underlying brain injury. I would expect more that she might have been dazed from that head injury, but I can't say absolutely that she wasn't rendered unconscious by it. It's possible.
All right. Well, excluding that possibility and looking at this as if she was, other than that injury, would she have been conscious to feel most of these infliction of these neck injuries?
Yes, she would have felt every one of them. And again, she would just feel the pain, but each individual injury by itself is going to cause pain. She would experience it as one episode of pain, but her body has pain coming from just in the neck, those 10 different sources.
Okay. And you believe that those would have been inflicted in the process of the strangulation, but she still would have been conscious?
Yes, sir.
And what do you base that on?
Based on the fact that there's not really a good explanation for her to be unconscious. I said there is the blow to the head. I don't believe that rendered her unconscious based on what I see in terms of injury. We know the physiology of strangulation and how long it takes for that process to cause people to lose consciousness. Again, that's 10 to 15 seconds. So for that period of time, with this process of strangulation, I would expect her to be alive, feeling not only the pain, but also the terror. It's been described, actually, strangulation, manual strangulation, has been in medical journals equated to waterboarding somebody. It's that type of terror, that type of, I need to breathe and I cannot breathe. I cannot escape this.
Now, the 10 seconds to unconsciousness is a baseline, and that's assuming consistent, continuous occlusion of the carotid arteries. Is that right?
That's correct.
So if there was only partial occlusion of one of the arteries, and there wasn't as much pressure, or the pressure was being exerted in an uneven fashion that allowed the carotid artery on one side to be open, the brain would still be getting oxygenated blood, and she would still be conscious.
The strangulation process, again, here we're not talking about artery compression, we're talking about vein compression. You have to block both sides for the discussion about consciousness to come into play.
Right.
You block one side, you still got the other side, the blood is coming in from the artery, leaving by the vein. So you have to block both sides for us to be having the conversation about loss of consciousness. We know that it was the veins, not the arteries, because she has the petechial hemorrhage. And if you remember, you squeeze deep enough to close off the carotid arteries, there's no blood coming in. No blood coming in means no petechiae. Here we do see petechiae, so we know that it's the veins that are closed off, both sides, and the arteries are open.
They have to be open for the pressure to be building up, for the blood to be going up into the head and the brain.
Correct.
But at some point, for her to lose consciousness, she's going to have the carotid arteries cut off, correct?
Not mechanically cut off, not by squeezing the artery itself. It basically is that backup process. The blood has no place to go. It can't leave. So no matter what the pressure is of the artery, there's a column of blood that won't move. And so they're mechanically blocked from inside.
Okay. So it's a mechanical process. The blood has been brought to a stationary, or to it's sitting still, I guess. It's not moving anymore.
Correct. It has no place to go.
And that blood, eventually, the brain is going to use up the oxygen within that blood?
Yes, sir.
And that's when the unconsciousness will occur?
Yes, sir.
All right. So all of that process has to occur before she's going to lose consciousness?
Yes, sir.
And if one side or the other opens up, she's going to possibly regain consciousness?
Depending on how long it's opened up and how quickly the force is reapplied, yes, sir.
So now I want to talk to you about, we've talked about she would be suffering pain from these injuries to her neck. Can you give us some type of a quantitative or an analogy of how much pain she would be suffering? Physical pain I'm talking about.
I guess the best way I could quantify it is if you've ever experienced choking on an object in your airway that just, it closes off. There's a pain there, and that pain is compounded by your fear of not being able to breathe. Again, it's kind of like the shoulders. You've got bleeding into a confined space. And here you've got external pressure causing that bleeding. It's an ongoing process. In a very highly innervated area, the neck is an extremely complex structure. It's got different compartments within it, and all of those spaces are filling up with blood. So I think it's fair to say this would be called extreme pain.
And is the neck, you've indicated it's very innervated, is it a sensitive area or at least a vulnerable area?
It's both.
So the pain, just the physical pain that Felicia's suffering from and feeling with the defendant's hands around her neck, squeezing with the amount of force that was required to inflict these internal hemorrhages, would have been a fairly significant amount of pain.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, you've talked about air hunger, and you've analogized strangulation and the feeling to drowning,
yes,
even to torture, like waterboarding.
Yes, sir.
when she was conscious, would she have been able to experience, and do you think that the sensations that would have been caused by strangulation of her neck by the defendant's hands, do you think that would have caused fear?
Yes, sir.
Do you think it could have caused trepidation or apprehension?
I would say almost certainly, yes, sir.
If she was conscious, would she have been able to cry from these injuries and from this process?
By cry, you mean tears,
Tears.
as opposed to crying out?
Yes.
She would have been able to do both. I just was asking to clarify.
And she would have been able to cry out if someone wasn't holding their hand over her mouth and muffling it?
Yes, sir. And then there are indications that, again, she moved, which would be supporting that she was trying to cry out.
And is that based on the injuries to her tongue and also the injuries to the inside of her lip that you were talking about earlier?
Those, as well as the hemorrhage to the longest coli muscle.
Oh, that's right, the longest coli muscle. So you think that is associated in great part with her struggling and moving?
Yes, sir. She's obviously got the forceful injuries to her shoulders, injury to the back. If those happen in a single episode, at that point in time, the assailant's hands are occupied, both of them. They're holding her shoulders. At that point in time, she's free to cry out, question what's going on, ask why. All of that she's capable of doing at that point in time until the assailant removes a hand, places that hand over her mouth, which might account for the difference in hemorrhage in the right and left shoulders.
Okay. Based on the injuries that we've talked about, do you feel that she was struggling and moving during this attack on her neck while she was being strangled?
Objection, repetitive.
Sustain the objection.
Do you believe that while she was being strangled and while she was conscious during that strangulation process, do you believe she would have had the ability to feel and sense her impending death?
I think she could feel a sense of dread, whether or not she knew what was happening until right at the very end. I don't know that everybody's had surgery, but that feeling if you are having surgery and the anesthesia is being given, and you wonder if that's the last thing that's ever going to happen. I've had several surgeries, and I have had that sensation, so I can speak from experience there. I don't know exactly what she was going through, other than the terror, the pain, and the why.
And the dread you mentioned would be something associated with that?
Yes, sir.
If she had lost consciousness and had regained consciousness, would she have been waking up out of that consciousness to the same physical sensations of pain that you've talked about earlier?
Yes, sir. She would be waking up. Initially, she'd be disoriented, and then the pain sensation, since the source of that pain is still there, would be still there. She'd have the same sort of sensations.
And could that waking up again process that could have occurred multiple times, right, in this scenario?
Yes, sir.
Could that have added to confusion? Or
Yes,
being confused? Would the fact that the defendant was a grown man, about 5'9", 170 pounds, and she was a little girl, 4'9", 120 pounds, would that have affected any of these mental and physical sensations that we've discussed?
She would be physically overwhelmed. If you take a male and female of the same size, the male tends to be more muscular. That's just a fact of human anatomy. But you reduce the victim's size to that of a child against an adult male, there's not really a contest there. The smaller victim understands that they are overpowered. And fight as they might, anatomy is anatomy. The more muscular male adult is going to win that battle.
You have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes.
Thank you, Doctor. I don't have any other questions.
Any questions?
Thank you. Good morning, Doctor.
Good morning.
This scenario that we've heard about of losing consciousness and regaining consciousness is pure speculation, correct?
No, sir, I don't speculate.
Well, you don't know whether or not a deceased became unconscious and then regained consciousness and then regained unconsciousness and back and forth, correct?
The discussion we had was about possibilities of regaining consciousness and interpreting the totality of Felicia's injuries. I don't know whether or not she regained consciousness. Like I said earlier, it may have been a single death grip, one grab, one hand or two, and that was held. It's oftentimes if a victim is struggling, as there are indications here that she was, then the assailant loses the grip and that clock resets. I can't tell you with certainty that that's what happened. I can only tell you it's very common. And the amount of hemorrhage in the neck, I believe, supports that. It doesn't prove it beyond any doubt, but again, I think it supports that there was a struggle and a releasing of that grip.
So your answer is that you're not able to say whether she lost consciousness and then regained consciousness, correct?
I can't say with absolute certainty. I can say my opinion is that she did struggle and there was a release of that grip. Whether she became regained consciousness when that grip was released, I cannot say.
And you indicated that the blow to the head, you're not able to say with certainty, correct, that that blow to the head could not have caused or could have caused unconsciousness?
Again, I don't see any reason that it had to have caused unconsciousness. I try to be fair with when I look at things. It is possible that she lost consciousness with that, but I don't see any brain injury that tells me she had to have lost consciousness.
Are you able to say if any injuries were inflicted after she lost consciousness and died?
The injuries that we've discussed, the vaginal injuries, the head injury, the shoulder injuries, the neck injuries, she was alive for all of that. The neck injuries, I believe she was conscious for that for 10, 15 seconds. The shoulder injuries, I believe she was conscious for because otherwise there's no reason to grab somebody by the shoulders. The inside of the lip injuries, I would give you the same answer. The head injury, to me, the way I interpret that makes the most sense to me is that she's held down, she's strangled, she starts to regain consciousness, she's popped in the head at that point and grabbed by the neck again.
But you're not able to say with any certainty that certain injuries could have been inflicted after she had lost consciousness, correct?
No, sir, that's my opinion that I just stated.
Now, you estimated, if I remember correctly, that this struggle took about 2 to 3 minutes, correct?
I believe I estimated about 3 minutes. Again, I try to go conservatively, so that would be the totality of the attack, 3 minutes or more.
But you're not able to say with certainty, correct?
To medical certainty, I can say that I believe it took at least 3 minutes. It could have taken significantly more time depending on how many times the assailant grabbed the neck and released it, grabbed the neck and released it. There's a category of offenders that do this type of assault called sexual homicide that they actually They control the situation. They are, for lack of a better word, masters over the victim. And they literally hold that victim's life in their hands. I don't know if that applies to the assailant in this case, but in my studies at Quantico, I did study about this type of offender.
Did you not say earlier that it could have been 2 minutes?
I believe the discussion about 2 minutes was regarding the to death strangulation. It could have been longer than that. If you tell me, could everything possibly have happened in 2 minutes? Sure, it could have. But based on what we know about the physiology, I think it's more reasonable that it was 3 minutes or more.
Now, you looked at autopsy reports and photographs and other data, correct, prior to testifying?
Yes, sir.
Okay, you did not perform the autopsy, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you would agree with me that certain opinions and expert opinions can be based on just on the limited information that you're provided, correct?
I'm not sure if I understand your question.
Well, would you agree with me that autopsy photographs and autopsy reports can only go so far in providing details of exactly what happened?
The purpose of creating an autopsy report or creating the photographs is to document everything that the pathologist sees, specifically so another pathologist, another expert can come in and look at it and opine about the very materials that have been documented. Obviously, I'm reliant on the documentation level that was done by the person that did the exam, but that in no way other than they saw what they saw, they documented it so that I could look at it. That doesn't change my ability to look at what I see and what they documented.
Now, well, let me ask it again. Does the fact that you did not perform the autopsy have any impact on your ability to provide details as to exactly what happened?
I would say, since I try to be obsessive compulsive about doing autopsies, honestly, the only thing I can think of that would be reasonable is I might have documented more injuries.
Now, you would agree, would you not, that most homicides, unfortunately, with exceptions such as a shot to the head, are not generally, most homicides are not instant death, correct?
I'd say that's a reasonable statement, yes, sir.
And consistent with that, you would agree that most homicides involve a certain amount of pain and suffering, as unfortunate as that might be.
I'd say that's a fair statement.
Now, you have been retained by the state to testify, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you charge an hourly fee of $500, I believe?
That's correct.
And that does not include other expenses such as travel from Georgia and hotel and other expenses, correct?
No hotels, and hopefully I'll get reimbursed for my flights.
Thank you. I have nothing further.
Okay, redirect.
Doctor, your business testifying and working in autopsy, doing autopsies, and as a forensic pathologist, this is part of your business, right?
That's my occupation. That's what I do.
And do you think you're entitled to be paid for that?
I would hope so. It's nice to make a living and put food on the table. And where I can cut people a break, I cut people a break. I've done cases where I worked, one memorable, I got paid for 2 hours. I worked 140 hours on the case.
Are you aware that most forensic pathologists who consult with either defense or the state are paid an hourly rate?
Yes, sir. It's an occupation.
People who do consultation work?
Yes, sir.
All right. I'm talking about doctors and forensic pathologists.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, I wanted to ask you about the consciousness versus unconscious. I'm not going to go back through it with you in detail or anything. I just want to ask you a question about it. process of having the jugular vein occluded and the pressure builds up and the oxygenated blood can't get to the brain and the person goes unconscious, and then you talk the person, let's go, before you get to the time period where the person would die, those several minutes that would occur, that would have to take place. And the person wakes up because oxygenated blood is restored to the brain. Could that have occurred when the offender is holding the neck? In this case, the defendant was strangling Felicia. She goes unconscious. He continues to strangle her. She continues to remain unconscious. Believing she's dead, he lets go.
Yes, sir.
And then she regains consciousness.
Yes, sir.
And then that process happens again and again. Is that possible?
Yes, sir. It happens quite often, again, with sexual homicide offenders in that category. Oftentimes are sadists. Again, they enjoy being the master. They literally hold the victim's life in their hands. So it's like a cat playing with a mouse.
And could it happen outside of the sadist part of it, or the situation where the person's a sadist, where they're just trying to kill the person and they think they're dead because they're not responding and they're unconscious and they let go?
Sure. I mean, unless you're an experienced killer, I wouldn't think you would have a lot of knowledge about the physiology of all of this. You have someone who grabs a victim who's struggling, grabs their neck, squeezes, they go limp. Well, they didn't just suddenly die, so you keep squeezing. And then surely that's got to be enough time, and you let go. Well, 2 minutes is a long time. And if you hold it for a minute, surely that's enough time. You let go and the victim comes to.
Okay. And then as far as counsel's questions to you about the length of the attack in this case, you indicated that you believe it was a baseline minimum of at least 3 minutes.
Yes, sir. Again, I try to be conservative with my estimates. That's the best estimate I can come up with.
And that's the baseline. That's the minimum.
Yes, sir.
For this entire attack.
In my opinion, yes, sir.
Right. But it could have been many more minutes.
Could have been a half an hour. I don't know. It depends on how the assailant gained control over the victim and the offender's actions, the assailant's actions during that time period.
Counsel asked you if there was some degree of pain or suffering in all homicides. Are all homicides involved, do they all involve children?
No, sir. The children, unfortunately, do make up a percentage, but most are adults.
But for the most part in our society, we try to value and protect our children, don't we?
Sustain the objection. Next question.
I have nothing else, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. May this witness be excused?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
State, do you have any additional?
No, Your Honor. State rest.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, the jury, it's now 11:35, so this is probably a good point in time for us to go ahead and take a lunch break. I'm going to give you a little bit more time today, so hopefully the weather's nice. I forgot to check. Maybe get outside, enjoy the lunch break a little bit more. We will reconvene at 1:15. Okay? So I'll give you a little longer than normal. There's some things that we need to do here that don't involve you. So I'll give you a little bit of longer lunch breaks. You're not just sitting around waiting for class. Okay? While you're out on break, just remember that my previous instructions, you're not to read, watch, listen to any news accounts related to this case. You're not to do any independent research regarding this case. You're not to speak with each other about anything related to this case. All right, see you all back here at 1:15.
All rise, jury exiting.
Okay, very good. Jury has left the courtroom, so we'll be back at 1:15. Yes?
Yes, Your Honor. Just for the record, I would renew my request to strike the juror that became overly emotional.
Well, I understand, and at this point in time, I'm going to reserve ruling. Let's see how the rest of the evidence goes, and then when we get to the final set of jury instructions, we can discuss this again, okay?
Yes,
So, we'll discuss it before we send the case finally to the jury for